Story about a great flood. A man is warned. He builds a boat. He loads it with animals. The waters rise and swallow the world. Everything dies. The boat survives. The man lands on a mountain. Life begins again. You know this story, but here is what you probably don't know this story, or something so close to it that the differences barely matter, has been found in over 200 separate cultures across every inhabited continent on Earth: Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, Hindu scripture, the indigenous peoples of North America, South America, Australia, and Polynesia, cultures that never met, cultures separated by oceans and millennia, cultures that had no possible way of sharing a text, a traveler, or a trading route. All of them told the same story. And the flood myth is not even the strangest example dot across the world. Independently, cultures invented a dragon, not the same dragon, but always a giant serpent or reptile, always associated with chaos, always defeated by a heroic figure, always marking the moment order was established from destruction. Ancient China, ancient Egypt, Norse mythology, Aztec cosmology, Babylonian creation texts, Greek legend, all of them. A serpent at the beginning of things, defeated so the world could begin. They invented a trickster god, a shape-shifting figure who bends the rules, causes chaos, teaches lessons through failure. Loki in Scandinavia, Anansi in West Africa, Coyote among dozens of Native American nations, Raven in the Pacific Northwest, Eshu in Yoruba tradition, Maui across Polynesia. The details change. The character doesn't. They invented a world tree, a cosmic axis connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. Yggdrasil in Norse myth, the Ashvatha in Hindu scripture, the tree of life in Mesoamerican traditions, the Jed pillar in Egypt. Different names, identical architecture. They invented the dying and rising god, a figure of power who descends into death and returns, bringing renewal. Osiris, Dionysus, Tammuz, Persephone, Inanna, the Green Man, cultures that shared no contact, no common scripture, no archaeological connection, all dreaming the same dream. So what is happening here? The simplest explanation is diffusion. One culture invented the story, and it spread, carried by traders and migrants across the ancient world. This is what most people assume, and for some myths, it's probably partially true. But it cannot explain all of it. The flood myth appears in Australian Aboriginal traditions that were isolated from the rest of the world for at least 50,000 years. The trickster appears in Native American cultures that crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge, and then had no further contact with the Old World for thousands of years. The dragon appears in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, in a civilization that built its entire cosmology independently of anything happening in Eurasia. Diffusion explains some of the overlap. It cannot explain the pattern, so scientists started asking a different question. What if the myths aren't traveling? What if they're being generated? In 2003, anthropologist Julian Tye began applying a method borrowed from evolutionary biology to world mythology. He treated myths the way geneticists treat DNA, as information that mutates slightly as it passes from culture to culture, accumulating changes over time while preserving a recognizable core. He built phylogenetic trees of myths across continents. What he found was that some mythological motifs are so ancient and so universally distributed that their common ancestor likely predates the migration of modern humans out of Africa. These stories are not 3,000 years old. They may be 100,000 years old. They traveled with us, inside us, before writing, before civilization, before language had the words to describe what it was transmitting. But that still leaves the question of why. Why these stories? Why a flood, a dragon, a trickster, a dying god? Why those specific shapes? Out of every possible shape a story could take, the answer that keeps emerging from multiple disciplines is uncomfortable in how simple it is. The myths are maps, not maps of the external world, maps of the internal one. They are descriptions of universal human psychological experiences, encoded in narrative form, because narrative is the only technology ancient minds had for transmitting complex truth across generations. Psychologist Carl Jung spent decades cataloging what he called archetypes, recurring symbolic figures that appear across cultures, not because they were shared, but because they arise from the same deep structures of human consciousness: the hero, the shadow, the trickster, the great mother, the wise old man. Jung believed these figures emerge from what he called the collective, unconscious, layers of the human psyche, so ancient and so fundamental that they precede individual experience. Entirely modern neuroscience has not validated Jung's specific framework, but it has validated something underneath it. The human brain, across every culture on Earth, processes fear the same way. It processes social hierarchy the same way. It processes death, renewal, chaos, and order the same way, because the brain that processes these things is the same brain, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures over the same hundreds of thousands of years. And when that brain tries to make sense of its experience by turning it into a story, it reaches for the same shapes. The flood is not just a flood. It is the universal human experience of catastrophic loss, everything familiar swept away, survival uncertain, the world beginning again from almost nothing. Every human who has ever lived knows this experience in some form. The myth gives it a container. The dragon is chaos, not metaphorical chaos, the actual lived experience of a world that could kill you without warning, that had no order, that required a hero to impose structure before life became possible. The ancient world was genuinely that dangerous. The myth encodes that truth in a form children could remember and carry forward. The trickster is the part of human experience that refuses to behave, the part that breaks rules, exposes hypocrisy, causes disasters, and somehow teaches the lesson that no straightforward instruction could. Every human society produces this experience. Every human society produces a story for it. The dying and rising god is death and spring. It is the most fundamental biological rhythm any organism embedded in a seasonal world ever observed. The world dies. The world returns. The myth is not superstition. It is the most accurate description available to a pre-scientific mind of the single most important pattern in the observable world. In 1949, mythologist Joseph Campbell published a book that would eventually sell millions of copies and influence everything, from academic anthropology to the screenplay of Star Wars. He called the pattern he'd found the monomyth, the hero's journey. One story, told 10,000 ways. A hero leaves the ordinary world, descends into darkness, faces an ordeal, returns transformed, carrying something the world needs. Campbell found this structure in Homer and in Hindu epic, in Navajo ritual and in Arthurian legend, in African folklore, and in the dreams his patients described to psychologists. He believed it was not a coincidence. He was right. But the reason is stranger than he fully articulated. The hero's journey is not a story about the external world. It is a story about the experience of becoming. Every human being who has ever lived has descended into darkness, faced something that threatened to destroy them, and had to decide whether to return. The myth is not a metaphor for that experience. It is that experience, given a form that could survive the death of every individual who ever lived it. This is what myths are. Not primitive science, not failed attempts to explain lightning or earthquakes, not the superstitions of people who didn't know better. They are the most durable information storage technology the human species ever invented. They carry truths that are too large and too old for any single culture to have invented alone, because they weren't invented at all. They were discovered over and over, independently, in every corner of the earth where a human brain sat down in the dark and tried to make sense of what it meant to be alive. The same story every time, because there was only ever one story to tell.